stay with me through every step of this investigation, because what we are about to examine reaches far beyond mythology or speculation. The question, where is Sophia today, has resurfaced across multiple disciplines, from comparative religion to cognitive science, and the records suggest that this recurrence is not random. Something about the idea persists, something continues to echo, and if you want more cases like this, subscribe to Omniscient, where we follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when that path crosses the border between the measurable and the mysterious. The earliest surviving references to Sophia appear in documents from the 1st and 2nd centuries, many of them discovered in the Egyptian desert and preserved against all odds. At first glance, the figure seems symbolic, a dramatized personification of wisdom. But as scholars began comparing manuscripts across traditions, a pattern emerged. Sophia was not simply a literary device. She kept showing up in texts that aimed to describe the inner structure of consciousness, the origin of meaning, and the tension between what humans perceive and what they intuitively sense lies beyond perception. The consistency of this pattern raised questions. Why would thinkers from different regions and different eras rely on the same figure to explain the same internal phenomenon? According to several early sources, Sophia descended, strayed, or fell from a realm of pure understanding into a realm of fragmentation. Investigators often interpret this fall not as historical fact, but as coded language describing a psychological movement, the shift from unified awareness into divided perception. In other words, a transition from clarity to confusion. Modern analysts consider the possibility that ancient authors were observing the human condition and attempting to describe a universal fracture in the way consciousness experiences itself. If that interpretation holds, the so-called fall of Sophia may not refer to a distant mythic event, but to an experience common to every human mind. As centuries passed, the story of Sophia did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. Jewish mystics began describing a dimension of insight that emerges when the mind becomes aware of its own depth. Early Christian thinkers spoke of a hidden wisdom that accompanies individuals through moral and existential struggle. Neoplatonic philosophers documented a form of intelligence that precedes rational thought and yet informs it. In each of these traditions, the language shifted, the symbolism changed, but the structural idea remained intact. There exists a form of knowing that feels older than reason, quieter than emotion, and more persistent than memory. That persistence raises a forensic question. Where is this phenomenon located? The texts imply that Sophia is neither an external entity nor a supernatural visitor. Instead, sources suggest that the location of Sophia is internal, but not in a metaphorical sense. It is described as a real feature of human consciousness, observable only under certain conditions. Allegedly, when the mind becomes still enough, a different kind of clarity surfaces, not learned, not constructed, but remembered. Many traditions interpret this resurfacing as contact with Sophia. In modern terminology, it would be called metacognitive insight, a moment in which the observer becomes aware of the observer itself. Reports from contemplative practitioners across cultures describe these moments with surprising consistency. They speak of sudden understanding that arrives without reasoning, a sense of orientation that does not depend on external information, and an impression that the mind briefly aligns with something structured and ordered. Researchers today would call this a shift in awareness. Ancient sources called it the voice of Sophia, though they clarified that it was not a literal voice. It was more like a stabilizing presence within one's own consciousness. This leads investigators to consider whether Sophia functions as a conceptual bridge, linking ancient descriptions of wisdom with contemporary descriptions of self-awareness. If the hypothesis is correct, then Sophia is not missing. She is not hidden in some esoteric archive. She is present whenever the mind becomes capable of observing its own distortions. That may be why the figure appears so often in texts concerned with memory, identity, and the origins of the inner life. These documents suggest that Sophia emerges not when individuals acquire new knowledge, but when they momentarily see through their own illusions. The recurrence of these descriptions across independent records is statistically unusual. It suggests that ancient cultures were observing a psychological phenomenon that modern science has only recently begun to measure. Evidence indicates that early authors believed Sophia returns whenever awareness deepens. This return is not depicted as supernatural intervention, but as recovery, the restoration of a capacity that was always present but rarely accessed. In many manuscripts, this restoration is described as the moment when an individual recognizes that confusion is not the final state of the mind, but merely one of its layers. If we follow the trail of evidence, Sophia today appears not in visions, revelations, or external manifestations, but in the quiet shift that occurs when a person begins to examine their own perception. According to the sources, this shift creates a form of internal coherence. Thoughts become less reactive, emotions lose some of their volatility. A subtle distance forms between the observer and the experience. Many ancient writers claim that this internal realignment was the true appearance of Sophia. So when we ask, where is Sophia today, the records point toward a consistent conclusion. She resides in the threshold between unconscious reaction and conscious awareness. She appears whenever the mind stops running and starts seeing. She emerges in the exact moment a person realizes that they are not identical to their thoughts. If these sources are accurate, then Sophia's presence is not mythological. It is observational. It is detectable. It is the internal event in which clarity briefly outruns confusion. In our next installment, we will examine how different traditions attempted to track this phenomenon and why so many of them believed that Sophia was both the origin and the destination of human understanding. Stay with me here, because part 3 brings us to one of the most contested claims in all ancient sources mentioning Sophia. If the fall represented the fragmentation of awareness, then the next question is unavoidable. What survived the fall? The records point to something referred to as a spark, a remnant, a trace of the original clarity. Later traditions called it the inner witness, the fragment of the high place, or the element that refuses to forget. Modern investigators have taken interest in this idea, not because of its metaphysical implications, but because independent reports across centuries point to a consistent internal phenomenon that does not decay under pressure. And if you want more research-driven investigations like this, subscribe to Omniscient. Early manuscripts claim that even in the midst of disorientation, Sophia retained a small portion of her original awareness. The wording varies from text to text, but the concept is stable. Something remained intact. Allegedly, this remnant was unable to prevent the descent, but it was able to preserve memory of the state that existed before fragmentation. Scholars examining these texts observe that this remnant behaves less like a character and more like a functional feature of consciousness. It does not choose, decide, or intervene. It witnesses. It remembers. It persists. This is where the ancient narrative starts intersecting with contemporary psychology. Research on what clinicians call the observing self describes a stable internal vantage point that remains present even when thoughts and emotions fluctuate dramatically. During moments of distress, confusion, or cognitive overload, individuals often report that a small part of them stays aware in the background, quietly monitoring the experience without becoming consumed by it. Investigators studying trauma, dissociation, and meditation have repeatedly documented this phenomenon. Its consistency across age, culture, and circumstance has encouraged some researchers to treat it as a structural feature of consciousness itself. Ancient sources describe the spark in nearly identical terms. One manuscript states that the fragment of Sophia did not forget, though she could not speak. Another claims that the spark remained above the chaos, though she lived within it. While the wording is symbolic, the underlying idea is clear. Even when awareness collapses into confusion, there is an internal element that stays aligned with a deeper coherence. Modern analysts would call this metaconsciousness, the capacity to observe the mind without being fused with its contents. From a forensic perspective, the persistence of this spark is significant. If consciousness were entirely reactive, entirely shaped by stimulus and environment, then no part of it would remain stable during fragmentation. But testimony from clinical and contemplative settings suggests otherwise. Individuals undergoing intense psychological distress often report a small, steady point of awareness that refuses to break. It observes even when the rest of the mind is overwhelmed. Some describe it as the part of me that watched everything happen. Others call it the silent core. These statements mirror ancient descriptions so closely that investigators now treat the phenomenon as a legitimate object of Cole's study rather than a poetic metaphor. A second element emerges in the records. The spark is not just observer, but orientation. Sources claim that this remnant carries a memory of the original state, meaning that it functions as a reference point. It does not restore clarity by force, but it exerts subtle influence, drawing awareness back toward coherence whenever possible. Researchers studying identity reconstruction have documented similar patterns. During recovery from psychological fragmentation, individuals often report spontaneous insights, sudden moments of alignment, or intuitive recognition of what feels true or right, even when they cannot articulate why. These events appear to be internal recalibrations guided by something deeper than conscious reasoning. The ancient claim, stripped of its mythology, is surprisingly technical. The spark is a stabilizing mechanism. It keeps the system from collapsing completely. It ensures that fragmentation is temporary, not absolute. This interpretation aligns with theories in contemporary cognitive science, proposing that consciousness contains a meta-level designed to monitor and correct lower-level processes. The spark could be an early metaphorical attempt to describe this regulatory layer. Another aspect worth examining is how different traditions interpreted the spark. Gnostic sources treat it as the living remnant of Sophia's original state, the evidence that clarity is not entirely lost. Jewish mystics later described an inner point of understanding that cannot be corrupted by external events. Early Christian thinkers referred to a seed of wisdom that remains intact beneath emotional turbulence. Neoplatonic philosophers framed it as the rational soul's connection to the higher intellect. Although their languages diverged, the function they described is nearly identical. Investigators must ask whether these parallels arose through cultural exchange or independent observation. The geographic and temporal spread of the sources suggests a mixture of both. But what matters for our inquiry is the consistency of the phenomenon. In every tradition, the spark is portrayed as the part of the mind that remains coherent when everything else becomes distorted. Contemporary research adds another layer. Studies on altered states, deep meditation, and near-catastrophic stress responses reveal that individuals can access states of heightened clarity, even in conditions that would normally compromise cognition. This clarity does not appear to originate from reactive processes. It seems to come from a baseline awareness that remains intact regardless of circumstance. Some neuroscientists have referred to it as the integrative center, though the terminology varies across research labs. Its existence supports the possibility that the ancient spark is not symbolic but neurological, psychological, and experiential. One particularly compelling detail appears in a cluster of manuscripts that claim the spark generates the first impulse toward recovery. That is, the moment an individual becomes aware of their own confusion, the spark is already active. Researchers studying metacognitive insight make the same observation. The first sign of mental integration is not understanding, but noticing. The ability to recognize confusion indicates that the observer is functioning. In the ancient narrative, this recognition is the earliest stage of Sophia's ascent. This leads to the central investigative conclusion for Part 3. The spark is the internal remnant that allows consciousness to reconstruct itself. It is the feature that makes self-reflection possible. It is the reason confusion does not become permanent. Whether we call it metaconsciousness, the observing self, inner witness, or the surviving fragment of Sophia, the phenomenon is the same. It is measurable, it is consistent, and it appears across centuries of testimony. In the next installment, Part 4, we will examine how different traditions attempted to track the spark's activity and how each described Sophia's presence in the human mind today. Stay with me, because Part 4 is where this investigation becomes multidimensional. Up to now, we examined the fall and the spark, the fragmentation, and the surviving remnant. But different traditions did not stop at describing what happened. They attempted to map where the phenomenon operates today. Each tradition approached the question with its own methods, metaphors, and constraints. Yet investigators noticed something striking. Despite their differences, their conclusions converge. And if you appreciate research-driven inquiries like this, subscribe to Omniscient, where we document the patterns most people overlook. When researchers compare the earliest Gnostic sources with material from Jewish mysticism, early Christianity, and the Neoplatonic schools, they find more consistency than chance alone can explain. Each tradition framed Sophia differently as a cosmic figure, an attribute of the divine, an emanation of intelligence, or an internal principle, but all used her to describe the same human experience. The moment when awareness pierces through its own confusion. Investigators reviewing these texts noted that none of the traditions positioned Sophia in a physical location. Instead, they treated her presence as a functional event occurring within the mind. In Gnostic material from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Sophia appears as the principle responsible for insight. She is described as steering, calling, or returning whenever awareness begins to reassemble itself. According to these sources, Sophia today appears in moments of sudden clarity, especially when an individual begins questioning the narratives that condition their perception. The language is symbolic, but the process resembles what contemporary psychologists call metacognitive activation, the point at which a person becomes aware that they are operating under assumptions rather than truths. If this correlation holds, then the Gnostics were tracking the earliest signs of psychological self-correction. Jewish mystical writings, though using different terminology, describe a related phenomenon. Rather than focusing on the descent and ascent of a figure, they focus on the internal movement of understanding itself. Texts refer to an inner point of insight that illuminates without argument and exposes distortions without force. Investigators comparing these descriptions to Gnostic material found structural parallels. Both traditions depict a subtle shift in awareness that reverses confusion. The difference lies in tone, not content. Jewish mystics treated this shift as a function of divine order, while Gnostics treated it as the surviving remnant of an original fall. Early Christian thinkers approached the issue through ethical and existential language. They rarely used the name Sophia explicitly, but several writers referred to an inner seed of wisdom that guides the conscience when external authorities fail. This seed allegedly activates during moral conflict, prompting individuals to question impulses and evaluate intentions. Researchers analyzing these writings found that Christian thinkers were mapping the same internal event described by earlier traditions, but framing it through moral development rather than metaphysical narrative. When modern investigators examine these documents side by side, it becomes clear that each tradition was observing a similar psychological mechanism from a different angle. The Neoplatonic school introduced yet another interpretation. They framed Sophia not as a character or symbolic figure, but as the expression of a rational order that precedes ordinary thought. When the mind aligns with this order, it gains access to a higher level of understanding. Investigators comparing Neoplatonic writings to earlier sources concluded that this alignment corresponds to the same internal clarity the Gnostics attributed to Sophia's spark. In Neoplatonic terms, this clarity emerges whenever the individual shifts from reactive perception to contemplative awareness. The terminology differs, but the underlying process remains consistent. From a forensic standpoint, the most compelling detail is not the philosophical variation but the empirical convergence. Independent traditions, separated by geography and spanning several centuries, documented nearly identical internal events: sudden insight, restored coherence, reduced reactivity, and reorientation toward meaning. Whether attributed to divine order, rational structure, moral awareness, or Sophia herself, the phenomenon remains the same. This raises an important question for investigators. Were these traditions witnessing a shared cognitive feature long before science could analyze it? Contemporary research suggests that the answer may be yes. Studies on spontaneous insight reveal that when the brain exits habitual thought loops, a distinct pattern of neurological activity emerges. This shift produces clarity that feels deeper and more fundamental than normal reasoning. Ancient descriptions of Sophia reappearing during introspection match these findings almost exactly. Some investigators now argue that Sophia was not a theological invention, but an early attempt to document this shift in awareness. Another crucial point appears in the records. Each tradition insists that the phenomenon is universal. It does not depend on belief, culture, or doctrine. It emerges whenever the mind becomes sufficiently still to observe itself. Researchers studying mindfulness, contemplative states, and self-reflective cognition have reached the same conclusion. The ability to access clarity is a built-in feature of consciousness. It is not taught, it is uncovered. This universality led some scholars to treat Sophia not as myth, but as model, a conceptual framework for understanding how awareness corrects itself. In this model, Sophia today is not a relic of ancient cosmology, but the name early thinkers gave to the internal event that restores coherence. The phenomenon occurs whether or not one knows the name. It operates whether or not one believes in the narrative, and it surfaces most clearly during moments of introspection, ethical tension, or deep cognitive disruption. In other words, every tradition we have examined points to the same forensic conclusion. Sophia is located not in the heavens, not in hidden archives, and not in lost myth. She's located at the threshold where awareness recognizes itself, the turning point between confusion and clarity. In Part 5, we will examine how modern science, psychology, and theoretical physics unexpectedly support this interpretation, and why researchers across these fields are beginning to acknowledge that consciousness contains a dimension not easily reduced to neurochemical processes. Stay with me, because Part 5 is where ancient testimony intersects with modern research in a way that even cautious investigators can no longer dismiss as coincidence. If earlier sections traced Sophia through myth, introspection, and philosophical tradition, this section examines what contemporary science reveals about the same internal phenomenon. The goal here is not to prove metaphysics, but to test whether the ancient model aligns with measurable data. And if you want more evidence-based investigations like this, subscribe to Omniscient, where we follow the records, not assumptions. When neuroscientists began studying insight, metacognition, and states of enhanced clarity, they expected to find random neural activity associated with sudden problem solving. Instead, they found patterns consistent, replicable, and remarkably aligned with the descriptions that ancient sources attributed to Sophia's reappearance. Researchers observed that when individuals shift from reactive thinking into reflective awareness, a distinct network of the brain activates while habitual circuits quiet down. This neurological shift is not subtle. It resembles a reorganization of perception, creating a brief gap between the observer and the mental content being observed. Ancient writers claimed that Sophia appears in these gaps. Modern investigators would say the cognitive system temporarily stabilizes itself. One compelling study examined what happens when individuals enter what psychologists call decentered awareness, a state in which thoughts are seen as events rather than identity. Participants reported sudden clarity, reduced emotional volatility, and increased ability to evaluate their own thinking. These descriptions align almost perfectly with the ancient claim that the spark of Sophia turns the mind toward itself. Investigators reviewing both sets of data noted that ancient storytellers were essentially mapping the same cognitive event using symbolic language. The similarity is difficult to explain away as literary coincidence. Another field that inadvertently contributes to this case is trauma research. Clinicians discovered that even under extreme psychological stress, most individuals retain a small internal reference point that watches from the background. This witness does not intervene, but it survives. It persists. It becomes active when the individual begins to reconstruct a coherent sense of self. Ancient sources describe the same dynamic. The spark remains intact beneath the confusion generated by the fall. Modern experts call it the observing self. Ancient records call it the surviving remnant of Sophia. Both describe an inner vantage point that refuses to be erased. Cognitive scientists studying insight also noticed something unusual. Breakthroughs often emerge not from effort but from stillness. When the mind stops trying to force solutions and instead relaxes into open awareness, patterns resolve themselves. One team of researchers called this the self-correcting capacity of consciousness. Records from the early centuries described it as Sophia working in silence. Investigators comparing these descriptions argued that both indicate an internal mechanism that reorganizes the mind without conscious direction. Ancient sources gave the mechanism a name. Modern science simply measures its effects. The overlap grows stronger when we turn to theoretical physics. Although physicists do not study consciousness directly, several propose that observation plays a more active role in reality than previously believed. Experiments suggest that the act of observing may influence the behavior of physical systems, raising questions about the nature of awareness itself. Ancient traditions frame Sophia as the principle that bridges perception and reality, allowing individuals to interpret the world meaningfully rather than mechanically. While modern physics does not endorse these metaphysical conclusions, investigators note that both ancient and modern models imply that awareness is not passive. It participates. Meanwhile, psychological research on meaning-making provides another unexpected connection. Humans consistently report a drive for significance that exceeds biological necessity. They seek coherence, purpose, and orientation, even in situations where such meaning appears unavailable. This drive is often accompanied by an internal sense that something essential is missing or waiting to be recovered. Ancient sources describe this as Sophia's call, the pull of the surviving spark attempting to guide awareness back toward its original coherence. Modern psychologists call it intrinsic motivation. Philosophers call it existential intuition. But across all fields, the pattern remains similar. One of the most striking correlations concerns internal reorganization. Ancient manuscripts claim that Sophia's presence becomes evident when an individual begins to see through their own narrative the moment they recognize that their assumptions are not facts. Contemporary research on cognitive restructuring documents the same turning point. Insight arises when awareness separates from its own distortions. This separation is the first step in psychological integration. It is also, according to ancient sources, the first step in Sophia's ascent. Investigators reviewing all these parallels emphasize caution. None of this proves that the figure of Sophia represents an external being or metaphysical entity, but the consistency between ancient descriptions and modern data suggests that Sophia may have originally been a conceptual model for describing a universal cognitive mechanism, the capacity of consciousness to notice itself, correct itself, and rise toward coherence. If this interpretation holds, then Sophia today is not a mythic remnant, but an internal event measurable across disciplines. She appears whenever awareness shifts from reactivity to clarity, whenever the mind recognizes that it is not identical to its contents, and whenever individuals regain access to the silent vantage point that ancient sources call the spark. In Part 6, we will analyze the investigative conclusion. If Sophia represents a real psychological mechanism, what does it mean for human consciousness today? And what evidence suggests that this mechanism continues to function across every life, whether recognized or not? Stay with me to the end, because Part 6 brings this entire investigation to its critical conclusion. If the previous sections established that Sophia may represent a universal mechanism of awareness, surviving fragmentation, restoring coherence, and guiding introspection, then the final question becomes unavoidable. What does this imply about human consciousness today? And more importantly, what evidence suggests that this mechanism still operates continuously, regardless of culture, belief, or historical context? If you appreciate investigations grounded in records, patterns, and cross-disciplinary evidence, subscribe to Omniscient, where we pursue the truth wherever it leads. Throughout this inquiry, one detail has remained consistent. Sophia's presence, according to ancient testimony, is not dramatic. It does not manifest as visions or voices, nor does it override the mind. Instead, it appears as a subtle shift, a moment when the mental landscape reorganizes itself and clarity emerges from confusion. Investigators reviewing manuscripts from the 1st to the 3rd centuries observed that ancient authors treated these moments as evidence of an internal companion, a remnant capable of bridging the gap created by the fall. Modern clinicians studying self-reflective cognition describe an almost identical event, a sudden alignment when the mind recognizes that its previous interpretations were incomplete or distorted. This parallel forces us to consider that the ancient narrative was not merely a cosmological story. It may have been an early attempt to document the architecture of awareness. If so, Sophia's location today would be neither mythical nor metaphorical. She would be located in the microsecond of recognition that breaks through cognitive habit. She would be located in the moment a person realizes they are reacting rather than perceiving. Investigators call this a pivot in the field of attention. Ancient sources called it the return of Sophia. Several modern findings reinforce this interpretation. Neuroscientific studies on meta-awareness reveal that reflective cognition activates a distinct neural network associated with monitoring and integration. This network appears to remain dormant until the mind steps back from its own content. When it activates, individuals often report that they see clearly for the first time in hours, days, or even years. Ancient sources describe these same episodes as the spark rising through the layers. The terminology differs, but the pattern is unmistakably similar. Investigators studying spontaneous insight noted another compelling detail. Clarity is not a reward for effort. It tends to emerge when the mind becomes still enough to observe itself. This state is difficult to measure, yet consistently replicable. Participants in controlled experiments reported that their sudden realizations felt like recognition, not discovery, as if they were remembering something rather than generating it. Ancient manuscripts reference this phenomenon repeatedly, describing Sophia's guidance as remembering the forgotten. The metaphor may be poetic, but the psychological effect is concrete. The records also emphasize that this internal mechanism operates independently of external belief. Whether a person follows a religious tradition, an atheistic worldview, or no particular philosophy at all, the spark, the witnessing awareness, behaves the same. It observes, it persists, part, and it reorients. Modern research confirms this universality. Individuals from vastly different cultural backgrounds describe nearly identical internal events when undergoing introspective breakthroughs. Investigators reviewing these interviews noted the same expressions appearing over and over. Suddenly, it made sense. I stepped back. Something clicked. I saw the pattern. These reports mirror ancient descriptions of Sophia, illuminating the interior, even though the individuals interviewed had no knowledge of the historical narrative. Another pattern that modern science unintentionally validates concerns the moral dimension of Sophia's presence. Ancient writings claim that the spark becomes more active during ethical conflict, when an individual must confront motivations or impulses that contradict their deeper understanding. This was interpreted as Sophia nudging awareness toward integrity. In contemporary terms, this aligns with the function of moral metacognition, the ability to evaluate intentions, not just actions. Researchers studying moral decision-making note that this evaluative process often emerges spontaneously, even without cultural reinforcement. It appears to be built into the architecture of consciousness itself. What investigators find most compelling, however, is the resilience of this internal mechanism. Even after severe psychological fragmentation, trauma, or overwhelming stress, the observing self persists. It may be quiet, it may be inaccessible for long periods, but it does not vanish. Clinical documentation confirms that in nearly every case of recovery, the first sign of healing is not emotional stability or cognitive clarity, but recognition the moment the individual becomes aware that they were disconnected. Ancient accounts describe this event as the first movement of Sophia's ascent. Forensic examination of these parallels suggests that the narrative may have been a conceptual framework for describing this same physiological and psychological resilience. If we accept this interpretation, then the question, where is Sophia today, becomes less mystical and more investigative. Sophia would be located in every instance of self-reflection, every moment of regained coherence, every recognition that thought does not define identity. She would be present whenever an individual steps out of reactivity and into awareness. She would appear in the pause before a decision, in the sudden realization that one's anger was misplaced, in the quiet understanding that arises after the mind stops arguing with itself. Ancient writers did not describe these moments as psychological functions because they lacked the terminology. Instead, they gave the function a name, Sophia. This leads to a final investigative conclusion. Whether we interpret Sophia as myth, metaphor, or internal mechanism, the evidence suggests that she represents the deepest layer of awareness available to the human mind, a layer that remains intact regardless of circumstance. It is the layer that thinks without words, knows without argument, corrects without violence, and remembers without memory. If the ancient model is accurate, then Sophia has never been elsewhere. She has always been located in the same place, the interior threshold where awareness becomes conscious of itself. This does not prove the metaphysical claims surrounding Sophia, but it does indicate that her story may encode the earliest documented attempt to map the hidden structure of consciousness. And if that is the case, then exploring Sophia is not an exercise in mythology, but an inquiry into the foundations of human experience. This concludes our 6-part investigation. If you want to continue following evidence-based explorations into the mysteries of consciousness, antiquity, and the human mind, subscribe to Omniscient, where every case begins at the threshold between what is known and what can still be uncovered.